Tantor Audio presents The Future of the Gun by Frank Miniter. Narrated by John Pruden. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Concord Hymn. Introduction. American Guns, Freedom's Tool. Among the many misdeeds of British rule in India, history will look upon the act depriving a whole nation of arms as the blackest. Mohandas Gandhi, An Autobiography. In a way, the future of gun ownership in America is about what happens to Mike Kay. He grew up in an inner city without a father, joined a gang, stole cars, had a felony conviction at 18, and odds are should have been incarcerated or shot dead by 21. He's a linebacker-sized black man whose first experiences with guns were with illegal semi-automatic handguns tucked into pants and stuffed into puffy jackets. Yet it was guns that eventually saved him from all the bad stuff. We met so he could tell me his story. We're seated in little plastic chairs made for middle school students. There is a small wood school desk between us. Mike is now in his mid-30s and drives a truck to pay the bills. He has tattoos on his arms of his 3 children's names. 2 of the names are in the shape of a crucifix on his left forearm, and the 3rd is on his right bicep. The 2 making the cross are wrapped in ivy, his wife's name. He can't own a gun because of his youthful felony conviction. It was nothing, really, just a stupid thing, he tells me. But then he pauses. I sense he knows he's paid a hefty price for his mistakes, and is grateful to be alive and in a better place. He tells me slowly, warily, "You know, I'd be dead or locked up if John didn't teach me how to handle a gun." John is John Anoni, who is speaking in a nearby classroom to 30 kids, most of whom are in middle school. The kids are here for Camp Compass, an after-school program designed to save inner-city kids from the bad influences of rough neighborhoods. The kids are friendly, respectful, and courteous, and will shake your hand when you meet them and call you sir or ma'am. John has found a way to save these kids by using guns as a carrot at the end of a long stick. The classroom is not in a public school. We're actually in an upstairs room of Joe Mascari's carpets and rugs in Allentown, Pennsylvania. If you're wondering what we're doing in a carpet store, so is Joe Mascari. He never thought he'd give up floor space to a program for inner-city kids. It all started when the public school where John teaches and began this after-school program told him he couldn't use guns as a teaching device because guns are a bad influence. John says guns helped save him when he grew up in a bad neighborhood, and guns, he says, are part of these kids' lives, though too often in bad ways. Teaching them about guns in the right way is what he thinks makes his after-school program so effective. Like a lot of kids from these asphalt and brick neighborhoods, John grew up without a father. His grandmother raised him. On weekends, he went to his mother's apartment in the projects. It was a violent and abusive place, he says, so I started going out behind the projects and hiding in this little woodlot. I'd sit there in the woods where nobody could hurt me. Pretty soon I saw a squirrel, and I started to stalk it. As time goes on, I got better at stalking and tracking game around that little woodlot. I was safe and happy there until I had to go back to the apartment. Mother Nature was saving me. Later, an uncle took me hunting, and I found a real connection to the outdoors. Guns, in this very different culture from what I knew on the streets, helped save my life. John says he found himself between 2 cultures, so he decided to take good parts from both. A lot of students wonder where I grew up and what color I am, he often tells people. New students sometimes ask me, "What are you?" I think they're looking for a role model they can relate to by skin color, so I reply by asking them, "What do you think I am?" After they guess, I tell them, "I'm half black and half white, but I look Spanish and I eat Chinese food." They laugh. I let them all know I'm just like them. A friend of John's introduced him to Joe Mascari. At first, when John broached the idea of having his after-school programs there, Joe said, "Are you nuts? This is a carpet store." But John kept talking, and pretty soon Joe gave him these rooms to use for free. Joe's wife was killed by a knife-wielding murderer. Most people would say he shouldn't be helping us because of that, says John. But he gets it. He gets that if she had a gun, she might be alive. He gets that something is rotten in this inner-city culture, and he gets that we're doing something about it. He even says if that thug had come to Camp Compass, he never would have done such an evil thing. So he helps us use guns to teach responsibility, to grow upstanding adults. Mike Kay, sitting across from me, tells me that 2 of his close boyhood friends are in jail for shooting at cops and that others are dead. He waves his tattooed right arm at the city streets of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and says, "People blame guns for all that bad stuff out there. I tell him it's not guns. I tell him how John used guns to save my life." He leans closer, puts his hands on the little school desk between us, and says, "The only way to save people like me is with good examples and by not lying to them about guns and all that. Those politicians who blame guns are making the streets worse. They're sentencing kids to death and jail 'cause they just don't understand." He shakes his head and says, "All those counselors I saw." He pauses again. His eyes tell me he's repressing a lot of things he doesn't want to get into. He says, "Only John told me the truth. Only John cared enough to do that. You tell the truth like he does in your book, and I don't know, maybe it'll make some difference." He takes a deep breath and continues. "Back in 1995, I was getting into fights, stealing, getting suspended from school, and all that. Mentor after mentor quit on me. I was a lost cause in their eyes, someone that would either end up in jail or dead by 21. Let me tell you, I was ready to give up too. But then I was introduced to John. Sure, I knew of John from elementary school. I remember walking by his classroom, always seeing smiling faces and hearing laughter. It was such a positive atmosphere. But I thought he was going to be another mentor to quit on me. But then weeks had passed and John was still there. He took me out to do positive things. He showed me life. It was weird. Guns in my neighborhood were bad things. The guys who had them got them because a gun made them powerful. Guns made them cool. Most of my friends got handguns. No one taught them about guns. Most of their dads weren't around. All they knew was a gun tucked in their pants made them feared, made them dangerous. But you know, Mike says, John took me out to a gun range and taught me to shoot a shotgun, then a rifle. He showed me how to unload a gun and to shoot safely by keeping my finger off the trigger until I'm going to shoot, and teaches me to keep the barrel in a safe direction and all that. He teaches me responsibility. He shows me how a real man handles a gun. He trusted me. No one ever did that. I didn't want to let him down. Mike shifts his feet and says, "So I stopped getting in trouble and got my grades up. John took me hunting. Soon I'm back in the neighborhood showing my friends the picture of the deer I got, and they think it's so cool. So all I want to do is go hunting. It was so good, so far away from the streets, and in my hands was this great responsibility, this gun, and all I had to do was handle it right, like a man does, and I'd be right and good and maybe get a deer or whatever. But looking back now, I know something else was going on. When John took me hunting in those days, we'd sit and talk about what was going on in my life and ways to make things better. I connected with John because I looked at him as a big brother, not as some social worker, and because he was showing me something I never saw before, how guns are tools and that when you do things right, they're good and you're good. I finally found someone to look up to and a way to prove myself with the very thing my friends feared and respected most. Guns. I had to earn everything I did with John. I had to learn discipline by hunting and shooting. He pauses again, and his eyes go down to the wood table before coming back up again. And he tells me that some of his friends from the streets wanted to pull him back. They thought those hunting photos were pretty cool, but they wanted him to hang out and do all that bad stuff he was getting away from. Mike says, eventually, John and I spent less time together. I was finally happy with myself, with my life, and I owed that to John. But then one day I was with a group of friends and they decided to rob some kids standing on a street corner. Not thinking, I stayed in the car instead of leaving. Naturally, we got arrested. I thought my life was over because I was the only one of adult age. The blame fell squarely on my shoulders. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. I never had a father figure. My friends were all I had. I couldn't call John. I was scared. I didn't want to disappoint him. Besides, I hadn't spoken to John in months. Why would he help me? Although every bone in my body didn't want to, my heart told me to call him. John took me in with open arms. He sat me down just like in the beginning of our relationship, and we came up with the plan to get myself back on the correct path. I've been on that same path ever since. Mike shifts his weight in his little plastic chair, frowns, and his eyes get emotional as he explains that he's now trying to get his gun rights back after that awful mistake almost 20 years ago. He didn't get any jail time for that robbery, just probation. Nevertheless, he has a felony conviction, so he can't own a gun. Now his wife can't have a gun because, as a felon, Mike can't be in the same house with a gun. That's eating away at him. She's not safe when I'm out driving the truck. She's not safe because of me, he says. He has a lawyer helping him try to get his Second Amendment rights back. He hopes he can have his freedom again. He only wants to live free and to protect his family and for his wife to be safe when he's away driving trucks. But the law is stopping him. He got mugged recently when he pulled his truck into a loading dock to make a delivery. The guy jumped on the truck's running board, pointed a pistol in his face, and said, "Sorry, man, I gotta eat. Give me whatever money you got." Right there, my life was in this guy's hands, says Mike. He didn't want to shoot me, and I gave him my wallet, and he ran away. But it made me think about my wife and kids alone at home, and that drives me crazy. Mike pauses, looks at the floor, and then back at me as he says, "In my time on the streets, I've seen what gun laws do. They ban handguns. So then all my old friends have handguns anyway, but the law-abiding people don't. What good does that do? You want to make the streets safer. You need to let law-abiding people carry if they want. That way you'll have people who are responsible being, good examples. They'll show kids by example how guns should be treated. There are too many guns out there to just ban them. I can take you to places right now where you can buy an illegal handgun, no problem. You want this to get better? You want a brighter future? Then enforce the gun laws. Let me tell you, they're not. And let good people carry concealed if they want to. That would have stopped me from doing a lot of the bad stuff I did all those years ago. It would reduce violence now." Mike's story is powerful, but he's far from alone. I talked to other people from the rougher parts of town who were saved by John. Andrew M. is 22 years old and of Egyptian descent. He is about to graduate from college and become a teacher, like John. He says, "When I was in the 6th grade, the police came and took my father away. It was in all the papers. The whole street knew they were arresting my father. He was convicted of rape and is still in jail. My father used to walk me to school, but now we had to move, and I was in a new school in a tough neighborhood. So suddenly I'm all alone, just a little scared 6th grader. John sees me there, and he knows all about it. He says, 'Don't worry, it's my first day too.' It wasn't, of course, but he knew just what to say. Right away, he welcomes me into Camp Compass. He saves my life. I'd be dead or in jail now if John didn't take me in and use guns and hunting to show me how to be a positive, hard-working adult." 2 others join me, Tiffany S. and Mike M. Tiffany is white and Mike is black. They tell similar stories. They say the only way to make the streets safer is with good examples, with people like John. Tiffany tells me about the guns she saw in high school. She went to a rough inner-city school with gang problems. Illegal guns were easily had and were used to victimize people. You take the freedom to own a gun away, and you get what John saved us from on these streets. You do that, and all you have left is the bad, says Tiffany. She's 24 years old now and has a college degree that helped her get a job in a hospital. Tiffany has always had health issues. They make her weak. They used to make her feel helpless. She says, "When John took me shooting and hunting, I learned confidence. He gave me this rite of passage to become a good adult." Most of the people I talk to tell me they don't hunt anymore, maybe don't even own guns, but they all back gun rights. I wish those who back gun-free zones could meet these people and spend time on their streets. Murder and violence took place before the invention of guns, and they will continue to take place, and have taken place at high rates, even in localities with stiff gun control laws. Guns don't cause violence. What guns can do in the hands of honest people is equalize the odds between a 100-pound woman and a 200-pound potential assailant, or between the good guys and the bad guys. There are two wildly different gun cultures in America: the freedom-loving gun rights culture that upholds the responsible use of guns for hunting, sport, and self-defense, and the criminal culture that thrives in spite of, or even because of, government attempts at restricting gun rights. Those two cultures lead to two different futures. The path we take will determine the future of the gun and the future of our freedom. Part 1. Future Glock. Chapter 1. Every American should hear this. Like history, it repeats itself. A 1904 ad for the Winchester automatic rifle, a semi-automatic 22 rimfire rifle. I say, swallowing a laugh, "Just tell me what you really think about America's love affair with the gun, Phil. Don't let me stop you." Phil Schreier, the senior curator for the NRA's National Firearms Museum, and I are standing right in the middle of the biggest gun museum in all the world, and he's just said, "Since David killed Goliath, the person with the more advanced weapon, not the guy with biggest muscles, has always won the fight." He says this as we're looking at the Mayflower gun, a wheel-lock carbine brought to America on the Mayflower by John Alden in 1620. Alden was one of the Pilgrim leaders of Plymouth Colony, so his gun was certainly at the first Thanksgiving. From the beginning, says Phil, handheld guns led to individual liberty. When this translates into an armed society, it tends to lead to a freer people. Trace the history of the gun, and you'll find out how European feudalism was finally ended. They don't teach that fundamental part of history in grade school, do they? I'm smiling as I say, "Not in the New York public school I went to." Phil grimaces and says with a sad look in his brown eyes, "Yeah, if school kids were just taught that the shot heard round the world was fired through an American forged and rifled barrel, they might know a damn thing about American ingenuity and how we really won our freedom. That way, they might just have a clue of what our freedom is all about." Before I ask him to unpack all that, he says, "School kids, hell, even the adults often don't even know what the British were after. The Redcoats were coming to seize a weapons depot. They were coming for the people's guns. They wanted to disarm the colonists before a rebellion began." Phil points to a flintlock rifle and says, "This just might be the gun that fired the shot heard round the world. It's from that period and region. It was the type of muzzle-loading rifle many of the colonists had." I look from Phil to this old flintlock rifle, and the connection between guns and freedom becomes as vivid as burned black powder. Phil, you see, is one of those short, heavyset guys who move so continuously and quickly you can't understand how they stay heavyset. But you soon forget about that because what he has to say is so authoritative. Phil knows more about the history of American guns than anyone. The History Channel calls him when they need an expert. When historians at the Springfield Armory, a museum run by the National Park Service, NPS, on the grounds of the original armory founded by George Washington, were stumped about a particular Springfield Model 1903, they called Phil, and he dug up the original records for them. That's the kind of history-loving, truth-telling, fact-ridden gun nut he is. That's why I'm here in this gun museum with Phil for a hands-on history lesson of the American gun. I'm thankful he's here to teach it, as this history is so politically incorrect that few are exposed to it. Yet this history is fundamental to understanding American freedom. More than that, if we don't understand our freedom's connection to the gun from 1775 to today, we're sure to lose our liberty. Phil keeps rolling along with the excited tone of a gifted teacher. If you looked down the muzzle of that flintlock rifle, you'd see grooves. That's rifling, as you well know, and the rifling grooves in this gun were cut by hand by a New England gunsmith in the early 1770s. After a pause for effect, he starts into a speech that gets him so worked up his arms begin to flail. He explains that, sure, school kids learn that on the night of April 18, 1775, hundreds of British troops marched from Boston to nearby towns. And yes, they learn that Paul Revere and others sounded the alarm and that colonial militiamen mobilized to confront the Redcoat column. They are even taught that an initial confrontation on the Lexington town green started the fight that led to a British retreat from a large force of Americans at Concord. However, Phil says, one small but pretty important fact few learn about that battle is the colonists actually had more advanced arms than the British troops. What those young minds aren't taught is that some of the Americans had rifles, whereas the British had Brown Besses, smoothbore muskets. The Americans' rifles could hit a man-sized target at 200 and perhaps 300 yards, whereas the Brown Bess was only accurate to maybe 75 yards, and those New Englanders were hunters. They needed to kill squirrels and rabbits to eat, so they'd learned to be marksmen. They used these skills and their rifle technology by lying behind rocks and trees and shooting the redcoats dead long before the British got close enough to use their 75 caliber smoothbore muskets. Phil points to an older flintlock made in Germany and says that though barrel rifling is thought to have been invented in Augsburg, Germany, at the end of the 15th century, American gunmakers improved on previous designs by making the American long rifle, what later became known as the Kentucky rifle. By looking at the German rifle and the American long rifle, there is no doubt that the American long rifle is quite a bit longer. By looking at features and designs of 17th and 18th century flintlocks, gun historians today can tell where each rifle was likely made. Like schools of art, different regions of the colonies used various stock designs and other features. Even though the American rifles were more accurate, the British, Phil explains, preferred the smoothbore Brown Bess because it lobbed a big bullet and because it is faster to load than a muzzle loader with a long rifled barrel. You have to twist a bullet down a rifle barrel, and that takes time. Redcoats were geared for close-quarter engagements between masses of troops, but the Americans at Concord didn't fight that way. They impolitely used their rifles to fire before the redcoats could get close enough to take advantage of the firepower from their less accurate muskets. There were downsides to American long rifles, Phil adds. They were comparably expensive to make, and their production rate was slow, as small arms makers produced them one at a time. So though General George Washington made significant use of snipers, most American revolutionaries were later armed with smoothbore muskets, many of them made in France. Nevertheless, Phil says, small private rifle makers in the colonies made it possible for the war to begin on good footing for the colonists. This helped to get the public behind the revolution, and, as a lot of British officers who were targeted during the war found out, it damn well helped American troops throughout the war. After a pause, Phil's voice grows smaller as he says inwardly, "Thus began the long and lovely relationship between American citizens, American gunmakers, and the U.S. military. A relationship still ongoing, a relationship that keeps us free, a relationship some are trying to end. If they succeed, our freedom will follow, as real freedom is linked to the gun in ways most don't comprehend." His serious expression grows into a Cheshire cat grin. We are just getting started, and he's excited to teach this stuff. This beneficial relationship didn't stop with the American Revolution, he explains. After the war, George Washington established the Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. The armory was founded to produce and develop arms for the military. The armory began making flintlocks in 1795. From then until its closing in 1968, the armory made weapons for the U.S. military. James Woolsey, superintendent of the Springfield Armory, a man who looks a bit like Ranger Rick in his National Park Service NPS uniform, told me when I visited there in October 2013 that, though most people aren't aware of this today, the civilian gun market and the government have always worked together. Now, of course, all our arms come from the private sector. When I ask why the armory closed, Woolsey frowns as he says, "The Army flubbed the launch of the M14. Meanwhile, some savvy entrepreneurs in a California aircraft factory were using new materials and manufacturing techniques to perfect the AR-15, the precursor to the M16. Soon, the U.S. government's Springfield Armory fell behind, technologically. This isn't politically correct to say," he adds, "but today a very innovative civilian gun market is what's keeping America's armed forces prepared and better equipped than other militaries." From 1777 until it was converted into a technical college in 1968, the Springfield Armory was the largest manufacturer of firearms for the U.S. military. There is a fascinating museum on the property showcasing America's history of firearms. From muskets used in the American Revolution to the trapdoor Springfield, first produced in 1868, the 1952 film Springfield Rifle starring Gary Cooper shows what a big deal it was, to bolt-action Model 1903s used in World War I, to semi-automatic M1 Garands used in World War II, and later to M14s, the Armory's firearms were all designed for the military. "The thing is," says Woolsey, "civilians simultaneously used these firearms types too. In fact, civilian gun designers like Samuel Colt and John Browning influenced and often collaborated with the U.S. military to design new and better firearms." Semi-automatic designs were so popular with civilians in the early 20th century that a 1907 magazine ad for the Savage Model 1907, known as the Savage Automatic Pistol, read, "Her property, her little ones, her own life. She knows are safely protected when she has a Savage automatic in her home. She knows its 10 sure shots are at her command, quick or slow, as she chooses, 1 to each trigger pull." Mark A. Keefe IV, editor of American Rifleman, says, "What's really interesting is that from about 1900 to 1940, semi-automatic rifles were more often used by civilians than the U.S. military. It was the civilian market that drove and tweaked semi-automatic rifle designs that made it possible for the M1 Garand." Phil adds to this by saying, "History teaches us that without the civilian gun market, gun innovation would fall on its face. Government procurement contracts come bureaucratically slow. If gun companies had to solely rely on them, most would stop innovating. This would let America fall behind in the world. Pretty soon we'd be dependent on other nations for our military's firearms, and our American people wouldn't know how to use them. Our military would lose the great advantage that comes from recruiting from a populace in which a substantial percentage knows how to shoot. Making sure Americans know how to shoot is, of course, why the NRA was founded in 1871. I knew what he meant, as I've interviewed Special Forces soldiers to find out if civilian gun ownership helps prepare citizen soldiers. Greg Stubbe, a former Special Forces sergeant who fought in Afghanistan, put it best when he told me, "In my experience, a lot of training time in the Special Forces is used to teach those who don't have gun experience." To put it plainly, the Special Forces are in the business of creating country boys. Stubbe adds, "I've toured the Smith & Wesson plant in Springfield, Massachusetts. I saw firearms headed for law enforcement and for the civilian market coming off the same lines. This is how America has always worked. It's how it should and must work. I saw again and again in training and on the battlefield that soldiers who grew up hunting and shooting recreationally are better soldiers. As I said, the Special Forces is in the business of creating country boys. If our free citizens are barred from using firearms similar to those used by the military, then we won't be as prepared as a nation. Also, my experience in war taught me," says Stubbe, "that law-abiding people shouldn't be put in a position where they're potentially less armed than those who might prey on them. I saw horrific things that the Taliban did to unarmed civilians in Afghanistan, things I don't want my children ever to see." Steve Adelman, a retired SOF operator and owner of Citizen Arms, agrees with Stubbe. He tells me, America's firearms culture helps the military and law enforcement. When I trained new snipers for my...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?